Good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Weeden, Hobart class of 1991 and Associate Vice President in the Office of Advancement here at Hobart and William Smith. I am so excited to welcome all of you to today's session, part of our virtual Homecoming and Family Week here at the colleges. Stephen Wong and I were contemporaries at Hobart, and we both attended the same high school as well. So I'm especially proud to have him with us today. The idea of offering our HWS community special access to the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum exhibit was, as Stephen said, discussed when he and I had dinner in Hong Kong 2 years ago, and plans for an HWS in DC were actually underway, but of course things changed. We still hope to schedule a gathering at the Smithsonian, so consider this an exclusive preview to that event and what promises to be an absolutely extraordinary exhibit. So I'd like to offer my thanks in advance to you, Stephen, for sharing your story all the way from Hong Kong and the story of America's pastime with our Hobart and William Smith community today. And thanks, Dan, to you as well for your time and for everything you've done to bring that story to life. So a few housekeeping instructions before you begin. I'm sure you've heard these many times, but please keep your microphones muted until we're ready for questions. Please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions or comments. And if we run out of time, we'll respond to unanswered questions via email. And I think we're actually recording this as well, so we can send out that to all of you. So now I have the pleasure of introducing HWS Associate Professor of Theater, Chris Hatch, who will lead today's discussion with Stephen. Chris has extensive stage experience acting in professional productions with companies such as the Utah Shakespeare Festival, the Indiana Repertory Theater, and Kansas City Lyric Opera, among others. These are just a few of his many day job credentials. What brings Chris to this event? He is also the resident baseball scholar here at Hobart and William Smith. Chris actually teaches a course on baseball and American culture and has twice presented at the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So needless to say, I think we tapped the right guy to moderate today's discussion. So with that, Chris, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jared. I gotta tell you, everyone, I'm really excited about this. We are here today with lifelong collector in one of the world's foremost authorities on baseball memorabilia and its artifacts, Stephen Wong. He's a Hobart alum from the class of '89, although from what we just heard, that might be 2009. I'll let you talk with Stephen about that. When he wasn't in the classroom during his time at HWS, he was also a member of the Hobart tennis team. Fast forward 3 decades, and Stephen is now chairman of investment banking for Hong Kong at Goldman Sachs and head of the bank's real estate group for Asia Pacific ex-Japan. And in his spare time, he's authored multiple books on baseball. His book, Smithsonian Baseball from 2005, profiled some of the finest collections in the world of baseball artifacts across virtually all segments of memorabilia. And it was voted the runner-up for the Casey Award, which goes out for baseball's best book in North America every year. Another book on baseball Stephen wrote was a book called Game Worn, which had a comprehensive focus and study on one of the most coveted aspects of collecting, game-worn Major League Baseball uniforms from the 20th century. This book also received runner-up for the Casey Award for Best Book in Baseball in North America in 2016. Adding to our discussion today, we're also honored to have a very special guest, Daniel Piazza, who's the chief curator of philately at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. Daniel's responsible for exhibitions, research, and acquisitions related to the museum's 6 million postage stamps and related artifacts. These objects form one of the largest philatelic collections in the world and the second largest collection at the Smithsonian Institution. Today, Stephen and Daniel will be discussing their role in the upcoming landmark exhibition at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum on the history of baseball, titled Baseball, America's Home Run. The exhibition was originally scheduled to open in June of 2020, but has been postponed until 2021 because of the coronavirus pandemic. Stephen serves as the senior honorary advisor and is also a major lender to the exhibition. And Stephen, I'd love to start with you. What initially got you into baseball, and then how did that lead into memorabilia collecting?
Thanks, Chris, for the introduction. And first and foremost, it's a real privilege and honor to be on this event. And I would thank all of you. And obviously, there's a lot of familiar names and faces on here that I have not seen since 1989, literally. So hope to continue to connect with you all and use this as the basis for that. Answer your question, Chris, it's really been a confluence of a number of events. I remember as a child, in the 1970s, I was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. Went to Candlestick Park to watch the San Francisco Giants play, how cold it was, eating hot dogs with my father. It was Mr. Coffee, Joe DiMaggio and his advertisements for Mr. Coffee. Seeing the famous painting of him, The Wide Swing, which was, painted by Harvey Dinnerstein and came out in 1974. And my favorite piece of baseball literature and prose ever written was by John Updike, who published in October 1960 an essay called Hub Fans Bid Kid Adieu, which was about Ted Williams' last at bat at the end of September in 1960. Updike was actually at the game and he wrote about it. And, if any of you have not read it, I highly suggest you do. It's an incredible piece. And it was all those things, plus one particular event. David Ghislani, who was my neighbor in Los Altos Hills, one day called me over. I think must have been 10 or 11 years old. So I got on my big wheel and I just scrambled down the street, going as fast as I can, skidding against the cement. I was so excited and I just ran into his room and he pulled out this plastic or sort of this sleeve, a wax sleeve that usually people use to store stamps. And he pulled it up and he pulled out a 1959 Topps baseball card of Roger Maris, who at that time played for the Kansas City Athletics a year before he joined the Yankees in 1960. And for some reason, it's like the seas parted. That was it. I can't describe it. Maybe it's an affinity to historical objects. The way it looked very nostalgic. It looked obviously very old, being from 1959. And that was really sort of the start of it all. And eventually when I went to Lawrenceville School with Jared, that I started to read a lot of books on baseball history and about players and events. And collecting became a way for me to forge a connection with the physical objects, with the players and events that I had been reading about in, great books by David Halberstam and Roger Angel, John Updike, and many, many others.
Well, since the days of Candlestick Park and the Big Wheel to now, how has your collection evolved over the years?
Well, like every kid growing up in America, or I should say most kids, I collected baseball cards. That's just kind of what you did back in the day. And, they go to the store and, you pay 25 cents and buy a pack of Topps baseball cards and open it up. And what happened was, as I was saying earlier, I started to become very interested in the nostalgic look of old school scorecards and advertisements from the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. And back then, they were very affordable. So I just had, for some reason, there's this gravitational pull to these type of nostalgic pieces of memorabilia that related to American history. But the medium was obviously through baseball. And so I started off very much as what we call a universal collector. I collected the gamut. I wanted it all: scorecards, advertising, vintage photography, baseball cards, postcards, whatever related to the history of baseball, I somehow wanted to collect. And then eventually what happens to most people is that your tastes evolve into historical significant items. And so when I went to law school and graduated and was a young attorney in San Francisco and generating my own sense of, a source of income, I was able to sort of purchase game use items. And the first bat I bought was a game use bat of Lou Gehrig. Now, this is back in the day when baseball bats of Lou Gehrig were very affordable, unlike today. So I wasn't making that much as a lawyer, by the way. So, it was really, when I held that bat in my hand, this was Gehrig's bat he used in the 1928 season. It literally sent chills up my spine because Gehrig had his hands on the bat, and it's the same thing with uniforms. So it's that connection that it came off the back of Willie Mays, Jackie Robinson, Tom Seaver, George Brett, whoever it is, or, Babe Ruth held that bat, or Ted Williams, DiMaggio, Hank Aaron, or Albert Pujols, right? Or Derek Jeter. And there's a connection to that, and there's an importance to that because the player had that on his back or had that piece of instrument in his hand. So when you look at paintings, it's no different from the paintbrush that Van Gogh, Monet, or Vermeer used to paint their beautiful Impressionism art back when they were, brilliant painters of their time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you talked about chills right there. I think many of us listening to that probably got chills just even thinking about holding onto that bat. That's exciting.
Yeah.
We have a question from one of our audience members. Do you have a favorite item in your collection?
Well, look, it's a very personal thing, but I think that if I were to nail it down to one, it would be Jackie Robinson's game-worn uniform he wore in the 1948 season. It's his road uniform. It's very personal to me. Robinson, as we all know, is one of the greatest American heroes in mankind, as far as I'm concerned. He broke the color barrier on April 15th, 1947 with the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he became the first African-American to play in the major leagues. To comprehend what he went through, not only in 1947, throughout his whole career, up until he retired at the end of the 1956 season, you can't imagine. The jersey I own, he wore in his second season in the majors. Now, remind you that when Branch Rickey signed him to the Dodgers, his oath to Rickey was that he was not allowed to answer any hatred with any form of action. He had to bite his lip and not react to racial taunts, to rocks thrown at him, racial slurs thrown at him in every ballpark that he went. My jersey's there, the one I own is a road jersey. So at Ebbets Field, he was somewhat revered and he was somewhat embraced because it was a Brooklyn Dodgers thing. Brooklyn Dodgers team had integrated baseball, and Robinson became a hero at Ebbets Field, not on the road. When he went to play the Cincinnati Reds at Crosley Field or the St. Louis Cardinals, at Sportsman's Park, games in Philadelphia, it was a very different set of circumstances. And so, wearing that sort of armor, as I kind of call it, and going through what he did is an extraordinary privilege to even, to have something like that, in a collection.
And in a period of time where jerseys weren't as disposable as they are now.
Yeah, and it's a very good question, Chris, because, no one ever thought about saving a uniform. Back in the day, all the way, through even the 70s, uniforms, first of all, were, they served a purpose, a utility for the players. Back in the day, each player in the major leagues would get 2 home and 2 road jerseys for the entire season. The end of the season, especially during the Great Depression through the 40s and the 50s, all the uniforms were then handed down to the minor league teams, particularly because at those days they were very resourceful. So all the uniforms most of them were given down to the minor league ball clubs or the farm clubs. Most of the times when they reached the farm clubs, the NY on the New York Yankees uniform was taken off so that they could put the name of the farm club on the uniform. So this is what we called a restored uniform, and uniforms that are restored are usually about drop 70 to 80% in value. But to find a uniform that's all original and saved, actually, instead of being discarded after the farm club use or discarded after major league use, is a miracle. Because again, why would anyone, it was all sweaty and all that and dirty from the whole season's use. So no one really ever thought of saving it as a collectible. It's very different from baseball cards, very different from postcards, very different from stamps or scrapbooks, which were meant to be saved because they are collectibles and mementos, but not uniforms. They were more of a utility item, so they often were not saved.
Well, speaking of postcards and stamps, I'd love to start to bring Daniel into this discussion as well. And Daniel, there's a fascinating relationship between baseball and the post office. And I was wondering if you could talk to us just a little about the relationship that the sport and the post office have had over the years.
Sure, and it's a pleasure to be with you and with your audience and chat a little bit about this subject, which is very important and close to Stephen's heart and mine as well. But with the nature of my museum's collection, which is postal and philatelic in nature, we come at this subject from kind of a unique angle, and that is the relationship, as you suggested, between the sport of baseball and stamps in the mail. And at first blush, they seem to be totally unrelated, but there are actually quite a number of different nexuses that we're exploring in this exhibit. So one is, and maybe the most obvious, is the commemoration of the sport on postage stamps in the United States, which started in 1939. The first U.S. postage stamp is issued that commemorates baseball, was issued in 39 for the putative centenary of the game's invention at Cooperstown, right? And baseball themed stamps continue to be issued today. So we're looking at the legacy of the design of those stamps, who's been commemorated and how, and the source of the designs. And that's where a lot of Stephen's game-worn material comes in, because what we have in our collection are the postage stamps themselves, but also the original artwork that was created of players in their uniforms. And with Stephen's help, we're able to pair the stamps and the original postal art with the actual uniforms in many cases that the players are wearing on the postage stamp. So helping our visitors kind of see that connection from real life to illustration to postage stamp, and how it sort of ends up in your mailbox. But then also we're looking at it from the point of view of recreational baseball. Was huge in the United States from the 1920s through the 1960s. Just about every industry, factory, business all had, employee baseball teams, and the post office was no different. There were literally dozens of postal baseball teams. We have jerseys and uniforms and trophies in our collection from various postal baseball leagues, so we'll be showing those. But then also the way that ordinary fans made their opinions about the game known in the age before social media and the internet. Well, the way you did it was by sending an angry postcard to Kennesaw Mountain Landis saying, "How dare you suspend Babe Ruth in 1921? Or what's the matter with you guys? Why don't you integrate baseball in 1943 and 44? So we have a lot of that sort of material that'll be on display too, the way that fans made their feelings and opinions about the game known through the mail.
So Stephen and Daniel, how did the two of you first connect, start to develop this relationship, and then how did it lead to starting to tap into Stephen's collection as part of the exhibit?
Well, maybe I'll start, and I will title it as Splendid Serendipity. And the reason why I say that is because Carolyn Gleason, who has been a senior editor at the Smithsonian Books, she's been there for a very long time, for over 20 years. And she was my sort of my chief editor for my first book as well as my third book. And during my book projects, I always told her that the pinnacle of my collecting career and my, my love and passion for baseball, the game and its history would to do an exhibition at the Smithsonian Institution at one of the museums. And I told her that if and when that could ever happen, I would die a happy man. And so literally about 3 years ago, I got an email out of the blue from Carolyn and she said that the National Postal Museum was planning a major baseball exhibition, and that Dan Piazza and Elliot Gruber, Dan being the chief curator of the museum and Elliot being the director of the Postal Museum, were actually flying to Hong Kong because they were going to attend a major stamp convention at the Hong Kong Exhibition Center. So I said, you got to be kidding me. Well, I want to meet these guys. And so they connected us. We had dinner. I had the audacity and the decency to take them in honor of Dan to the best Italian restaurant, the same one that I took Jared Weeden to when he came to Hong Kong, a place called Da Domenico's. And that was the key to Dan's heart. And that was literally the spark. We talked baseball the whole dinner. And lo and behold, we just started working together. Now it's been about 3 years, and the project just sort of took off on its own. Dan sort of being the mastermind behind the themes and the narrative, touching upon all the themes that the exhibition's going to address. And then we just started working very closely together on designing that, coming up with the artifacts that would help commemorate what we were trying, the message that we were trying to convey through the exhibition. And it's been an incredible journey. But Dan, you should also add your perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, it's been tremendous fun, but that was basically it. I mean, I was in Hong Kong to give a couple of lectures at a stamp show, and I was promised an Italian dinner, and how can I turn down an Italian dinner? But we met Stephen at his apartment before we went to dinner, and right there, I think it was in a beautifully lighted case and everything, was the Lou Gehrig jacket from 1939 that we're showing in the exhibition. And in the taxi cab on the way to the restaurant, we were chatting about different things we had seen in his apartment. And I said, "Oh, how long have you had that?" He said, "Oh, I just got that like last week or 2 weeks ago. You guys are the first people to see that." And so it was, I mean, a curator's dream, right? One-stop shopping. How could you? One-stop shopping, and he fed me, and he hasn't been able to get rid of me since.
Well, that's great. And you even just covered my next question of maybe one piece that excited you a little extra about Stephen's collection. That's amazing. That's an amazing piece right there.
So that Lou Gehrig jacket that Dan had referred to is the actual New York Yankees team jacket. Each player was given a jacket for the entire season. Obviously, they only wore it sort of in the spring and the fall when it's cold. But that was the jacket that Gehrig wore on May 2nd, 1939 at Briggs Stadium. The Yankees were playing the Detroit Tigers, and Gehrig wore that jacket, walked to home plate, and told the umpire that I'm pulling myself from the game. Wow. So that is the jacket when he was wearing when he pulled himself for the lineup after 2,130 consecutive games, which is obviously what we know is the record that was broken in 1995 by Cal Ripken.
That's incredible.
And 1939 ends up being such a touch point for the exhibition. It's such a critical year for baseball in so many ways. First the event that Stephen just described in May, then in June you have the opening of the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, and the first really professionally marketed and managed sporting anniversary really in history. Major League Baseball and the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown hired a professional ad agency, produced what they called the Cavalcade of Baseball in Cooperstown to open the Hall of Fame. And they pulled into their orbit and into the planning of the committee a guy, another New Yorker named James Farley, who had been FDR's campaign manager, but was now in 1939 Postmaster General, and an inveterate Yankees fan. And that's how we get the postage stamp issued in Cooperstown in 1939 for the opening of the Hall of Fame. Then, of course, just the next month is Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day at Yankee Stadium, which is, one of the great iconic moments of the sport. And then the next month, in August of 1939, at the World's Fair, we have the first televised baseball game ever. And it's televised a distance of only a few miles from Flushing, to Dodger Stadium. But boy, 1939 just was such an incredible year in the history of baseball, and through both the philatelic material and the baseball memorabilia from Stephen's collection, we're able to tell the story of that incredible year in baseball history.
I love the excitement that is just coming through the camera as we talk about this right now. And I want to make sure that I get to some of the questions that have been asked by, I could ask questions all day, but I want to make sure that, that our other attendees have some opportunities. Stephen, one question that was asked by one of our audience members is, have you ever been able to meet any of the people for whom you have iconic pieces of their memorabilia?
Absolutely. There are been many cases. I can sort of name three. I'll start with that. One was, it's not an iconic piece, but one that has huge sentimental value to me. When I was about 10 years old, and this is when we were in the San Francisco Bay Area, me and my parents went to an Italian restaurant every weekend called Paolo's, which was in San Jose. And it was our favorite home style Italian restaurant. And every Saturday or Sunday, my dad took my mom and I to that restaurant. There was a very important episode of Star Trek that I could not miss. And so I decided to stay home and not go with my parents so I could watch it. So then about a couple hours later, the car comes in the garage. My dad and mom come up to me as I'm watching TV. And my dad looks at me and said, "Bad decision, big mistake." And he hands me a menu from Paolo's. And on the top right, it said, "Dear Stephen, it's so disappointing that you were not with your parents tonight. Best wishes, Joe DiMaggio." And so Joe DiMaggio was at the restaurant with his, I guess it was two other gentlemen. My father went up to Joe and said, my son is nuts about baseball. He's nuts about you because I told you my affinity of seeing Mr. Coffee, and I always told my parents I just love Joe DiMaggio. And the one time I didn't go was that time. I think the second incident was, I had met Ted Williams. Ted Williams is probably one of my heroes in baseball, next to Jackie Robinson and Lou Gehrig and Willie Mays. But Leigh Montville and Bill Bradley wrote amazing bios of Williams. And I liked Williams because he was such a perfectionist and such an astute focus on one thing, and that was hitting. And, he served in 2 wars. He served in World War II. He also served in the Korean War. So he essentially lost 6 years out of the prime of his career to serve his country. And that's sort of very symbolic of those days. You think of Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra served on the boats in D-Day when, Doghead's Beach and Omaha Beach in Normandy, France, which was made famous by the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan by Steven Spielberg, that featured Tom Hanks. Berra was on one of those boats, but he never, ever talked about it throughout his whole life. And his wife, Carmen, before she passed away after Yogi did, said that in his generation, which was so beautifully captured by Tom Brokaw in his book called The Greatest Generation, that was a sense of duty. It's not something that you talked about or bragged about. So Williams and Berra, to a certain extent, kind of heroic in that sense. And then lastly, Brooks Robinson. He's probably one of my favorite players as well. Just because the guy was, I love this name, the human vacuum, and I always sort of, I always looked at a Hoover vacuum and I thought of Brooks Robinson and what he did, in the 1970 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. And I had the privilege of meeting Brooks about 3-4 years ago in Chicago, actually in Rosemont, which is just outside of Chicago. It was the national convention and we were at a steakhouse called Gibson's. And I got to dine with Brooks Robinson, and that has to be one of the highlights of my life.
Wow.
So,
yeah,
there you go.
Here's another great question that's just come in is, do either of you, either at the exhibition, in a private collection, have umpire memorabilia of any sort?
Dan, do you want to start or?
There's nothing I can think of in the exhibition about umpires, no.
Yeah. I must say that the only umpire or two umpire artifacts I have is I actually have the ball that was signed by all the umpires at the game where Cal Ripken broke Gehrig's record. And then I have an autograph photo of Bill Clem, who was one of the greatest umpires in the first 2 decades of the 20th century and is in the Hall of Fame.
A follow-up question to that then. I teach this class on baseball, and one of my favorite, we spend a little bit of time talking about memorabilia and the notions of memorabilia. And one question that I like to ask my students, and it's fascinating that this came up, is what would they rather have? An autograph, which for me was something that you always aspired to get, someone's autograph, or a selfie, an autograph or a selfie. And I have to tell you that all of a sudden it's becoming about a 50-50 split in classrooms now. If our students would rather have an autograph piece of something or a selfie. And I'm just wondering, I'd love to hear what you two think about the notion of autographs and why they've become such a coveted aspect of memorabilia and memorabilia collecting.
Well, I mean, maybe I'll start and then Dan should chime in. Look, autographs, like game-used bats and game-worn uniforms, the historical significance, or I should say the inherent significance of autographs is that the player held that object in his hand to sign it. So like the menu I was talking about, right? Joe DiMaggio held that menu to sign that autograph to me. And the bat of Jackie Robinson or the bat of Ted Williams, he held that bat in his hand. Or the uniform of Willie Mays. Willie Mays wore that on his body for the entire season. His blood, sweat, his DNA is intertwined in that fabric. So there lies the inherent significance. It's very different from a baseball card, a postcard, a scorecard, or a painting of a player, which, there is no physical connection to the player. It's just a consumable or a consumer item that may commemorate them, but it doesn't really have any connection or direct physical connection to the actual player. And that's not to, in any way, to downplay those pieces of memorabilia, because it's each to their own. Everyone should enjoy what they collect, Chris, just like the statues behind you. I mean, those give you a certain emotional enjoyment, and that's what it's all about. But to your question, autographs are hugely significant is because the player touched that object. And I think people really gravitate towards that. And why autographs are, have been and continue to be such a important part of collecting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the tactile nature is really important, and it's interesting that you see this, that you see maybe this kind of trend or the pendulum swinging the other way. What you may be seeing too is a little bit of digital overload now starting to creep in, and people wanting to go back to those kind of tactile experiences. But I think there's, in addition to knowing that the player held the item, you know, in order to autograph it, there's just something intensely personal about an autograph or a signature that I think is just, it's hard to express in something like a selfie or photograph, you know. Yeah, there is, at the end of the day, there's something inexplicable about some of these things and why people are attracted to them. Stephen called it earlier gravitational pull, you know, and that's probably right. I feel the same way about postage stamps, obviously, you know. I mean, something ephemeral and insignificant, but just exerts some kind of an influence over us.
Daniel, I just got a great question that I'd love to send your way. Is so many mascots are now racially insensitive, and we realize that we should not be using those mascots anymore. When putting together an exhibition like this, how do you balance sort of representing baseball history with sort of modern day sensibilities in terms of things like that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It is a lot of times we focus on the object, but really in a museum setting, I think a lot depends on the interpretation of the object and the context that you place it in. So I think one of the reasons that some of these symbols and, you know, statues, monuments, icons, all of these things that we're talking and thinking about right now. One thing that I notice, the ones that, although most people maybe wouldn't think of it this way or articulate it this way, I think one of the things that that people instinctively know, even if they can't really express it, is that it's when it's out of context, when it's devoid of interpretation, when it's very jarring. I think those are the examples that really. Then clearly that thing is there to make a point, right? And what is that point? One of the great things about a museum setting is you can have objects like this and then have interpretation around it. Well, where did this imagery come from? How was it used? You know, why do we not use it anymore? And so on and so forth. So I'll give you an example, not necessarily related to baseball, but I did an exhibit at the Postal Museum 5 years ago called Freedom Just Around the Corner, Black America from Civil War to Civil Rights. And one of the phenomena of postal system of the 19th century is that nowadays cancellation devices that people use to postmark the mail, cancel the stamp, are standard issued by the government, but they weren't in the 1860s and 70s. Local postmasters procured their own, bought their own, some of them made their own and whittled their own. And there were some postmasters in the 1870s who whittled things like KKK hoods to use to cancel the mail. And so one of the things that we had in the exhibition were these KKK postmarks from the 1870s, along with a KKK hood in the exhibit. And I expected all sorts of having to do all sorts of explanation and interpretation of this object, prepared these sort of briefs in advance. And I like to think it's because of that we interpreted it well and told the story, you know, correctly and accurately, that there was almost no pushback to this object, which I had expected. See, museums are a place where you can take these things, I think, and put them in context and explore them, in historical settings, if that makes sense.
Yeah, great. Stephen, we've got a question that just came in. With players changing teams more often now, do you think, and with sports being so much more available through media, do you think that has positive or negative or mixed ramifications to the memorabilia side of things, to collecting?
Well, that's a good question. I would answer that in a couple ways. First and foremost is there is a very stark line between collectibles from, let's say, the 1970s and prior versus the 1980s up until today. In the 80s, 90s, and up until today, things have very much been mass produced. So you lack scarcity value, rarity, and particularly from 2000 to today, it's still, you really don't have that nostalgic sort of concept that you do for things that are a lot older. When you get to the 70s and prior, it drops off a cliff. It becomes very rare. It becomes very scarce. I mean, there's just a handful of most of these artifacts, a lot of them that you will see in the exhibition. Many of them are one of a kind, or one of two or three or four or five known in existence. And so the difference is that when you get to the modern era, and when I say the modern era, I kind of talk about the 90s and, you know, and the 2000s. It's a lot of it's mass produced. And again, I go back to what I always say, just because of that, it doesn't in any way denigrate or make insignificant things that people like to collect from the year of 2010 or 2005, because collecting is a very personal endeavor. And as long as it brings enjoyment to, you know, this whoever is collecting, that's what's the most important. But, you know, players, yes, there's some element of that. I mean, rare do you get a Derek Jeter that, you know, played for one team his entire life. I mean, when you go back in time, it's a lot more prevalent. You know, Jackie Robinson only played for the Dodgers. Willie Mays technically only played for the Giants, although he ended up with the Mets and all that and committed sacrilege. But, you know, Ted Williams played his entire life with the Red Sox. Joe DiMaggio played his entire, you know, with the Yankees. Stan Musial with the Cardinals, on and on and on. So the fact that players move around now because the salaries that they get are so exorbitant because of social media and all that, it's a very different ethos of collecting. And collecting today, again, and that's kind of a long-winded way of saying is that at the end of the day, collecting what you like is really what matters most. I think what I'm getting at is it's very different, and it's also impacts value in terms of valuation. Artifacts that you'll find from the 1990s and onwards, unless they are tied with a landmark historical event. In other words, if you had the uniform that Cal Ripken wore in 1995 when he broke Garrett's record, yes, that is going to be extremely valuable. Just like if you had the bat that Kurt Gibson used in the 1988 World Series against the Oakland A's against Dennis Eckersley, and he hit that home run in the bottom of the ninth and won it for the Dodgers. You know, so there are many cases where modern memorabilia can command huge values, but they don't have the rarity. Outside of that, most of the modern stuff doesn't have rarity. When players move around, you don't have artifacts that capture the essence of that player, right? When you think of Stan Musial, you think of Cardinals. Or you think of DiMaggio, you always think of Yankees. Where you think of some of the newer players who played on 5 teams, there is no affiliation. So I think it hurts that player's, you know, memorabilia or its artifacts.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think that what I think that modern material does is it serves as an entry point for collecting for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then people who start collecting more modern material, of them, a certain percentage will then start in stamp terms. We talk about the modern issues and the classic issues, you know, before 1940, roughly. You know, a certain percentage of people who start collecting modern material will eventually make their way back into the classics and start taking an interest in those. So it serves as a gateway drug.
Well,
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a very good point Dan raised.
Well, speaking of that, that ties great with another question from our audience. As you talk about the initial steps of collecting, the gateway drugs that then lead you to higher levels of collecting, perhaps. One of our audience members asked, was there a specific piece that when you got that piece, you knew that your level of collecting had just bumped up to a whole nother level?
Yeah, well, that was what I talked about in the beginning of this session was Lou Gehrig's bat.
Yeah.
It was that as well as his jersey and Dizzy Dean's uniform that he wore in the 1933 season, which will also be in the exhibition. And those were acquired back in 2000, so 20 years ago. And this is at a time where no one was really seriously collecting uniforms or bats, just because they were misunderstood. There hadn't been a lot of literature published on that segment of collecting. And they weren't considered as mainstream artifacts like baseball cards or other forms of memorabilia were. So to answer your question, the move from sort of display pieces to game used, be it a bat or uniform, that brought me to a whole nother level and a whole new level of appreciation for baseball artifacts, because I just can't describe to you, the feeling, like Dan was saying, when you look at postage stamps, or even when I look at baseball cards, right? I get that feeling, that gravitational pull. It is just like the seas part. You're just staring. It's kind of like at Wayne's World. Remember when he was looking at the guitar, outside of the shop, and you had that song Dreamweaver come on. It's kind of like that. You just can't describe it, but you just stare at it. And, maybe it's a nostalgic thing or old, or appreciation for history or whatnot. It's a combination, a confluence of all those specific factors. But for game worn or game used items, it is no different from looking at Albert Einstein's pipe, which is displayed at one of the Smithsonian museums. Or if you looked at, the paintbrush of Van Gogh or Picasso, that he used, that Van Gogh used to paint Starry, Starry Night. I mean, if you saw that paintbrush, I think most people, I would be staring at that thing for half an hour, because you're just like, my God, this is, one of the most famous, paintings of all time. And this genius used that paintbrush to paint this painting, which is, we all know, is in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay. Likewise, when you look at a bat that Babe Ruth used in the 1920 season, which will be in the exhibition, his first year with the New York Yankees, he hit more home runs that season than the entire National League, right? And he resurrected baseball using that bat as his median to resurrect baseball out of the wrath of the 1919 Black Sox scandal. When the Chicago White Sox threw the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds, and baseball attendance plummeted because they thought it was a crooked game. It was paid off by a gambling syndicate headed by Arnold Rothstein, who was one of the most infamous gamblers in American history. They said that he would bet on anything except the weather because he couldn't fix the weather. And so, when you look at that bat, wow, when Ruth held that bat to save baseball from the wrath of the Black Sox scandal and essentially bring people back to the ballpark and restore the faith of the game, it sends chills up, people's spine.
Yeah. Daniel, do you have your Dreamweaver moment where you got that piece that you're collecting?
Well, I mean, there are certain symptoms that you look for to make a diagnosis of this disease, which only metastasizes. It never gets better. You just learn to live with it. And one of them is, and I think Stephen will appreciate this, one of them is when you find yourself buying something that you already have because this is a better copy, right? This is a better example. and you have to explain this to your wife, you know, why you're buying this thing that you've already bought, and you have to convince her that, oh, this is a better example, you know. I mean, that's a clear indication that this has progressed to an untenable state, where there is no hope for this patient.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
I mean, stamp and baseball card collectors, Chris, are very condition sensitive.
Mhm.
And it almost comes to the point of lunacy. It's just, but that's part of collecting. You know, you're very meticulous about certain things, and you know, you have certain eye towards certain things, and you want, you know, depending on the artifact. You know, baseball cards, like stamps, the better condition they are, the more valuable they are. Game used, it's very different. Game used bats or game worn uniforms derive their significance from being used. A mint condition bat that a player never used, and it just stuck, you know, was just sitting in in the dugout of the Polo Grounds or Ebbets Field and never used by Willie Mays or Jackie Robinson, is worthless. Not worthless, but it's a lot less significant than a game used bat that shows characteristics of game use, and particularly characteristics of game used by Mays or Robinson. And
Wow.
believe it or not, you know, bats in and of itself are an incredibly interesting segment of collecting, because every player had their own characteristics. Ty Cobb spit tobacco juice on his bats because it was a way to intimidate the pitcher. So the best Cobb bats have evidence of tobacco juice all along the bat, let alone he taped the handle with tape. So most of the Cobb gamers come with tape. You have cleat marks all around it because he used the, you know, to get the mud off his cleats. So you actually see those tick marks all along the barrel of the bat because they're permanent, you know, in the wood. Williams, you know, used and scored the handle. So did Hank Greenberg, right? So it is all these characteristics that really make it fascinating. Again, going to the notion that when you tie that artifact to a specific player and you see scoring on a handle of a Williams bat, you see the number 9 in black paint on the handle, the end of the bat, which is what Williams did, because, you know, when you have number 9, that's Williams' bat, and he pulled it out of the bat rack in the dugout and went to the plate. It's pretty exciting.
But, and you know, on this question of condition, though, there isn't always agreement. So I'll give you a quick example of where Stephen and I were in the process of putting this exhibit together. We were talking past each other for a while, and that's on this issue of, you know, in time period of roughly, say, 1908, 9 through the early 1920s, a number of baseball card publishers actually published baseball cards that were postcards meant to be sent through the mail. Yep. And these are recognized and collected both by baseball collectors and by postal and philatelic collectors. And I read an article about these, and I called Stephen and asked if he had any. Oh, sure, I'll send you some images of them. And he sent me some images of one from his collection. He said, I think you'll really like these. They're beautiful condition. And I wrote back and I said, well, actually, I would really be interested in these 3 down here at the bottom. And Stephen says, well, what do you want those for? The corners are bent. They've got ink smudges on them. I said, yes, but those ones have been through the mail. Those ones are thereby they became postal artifacts. And you know, so we were both interested in condition, right? But we were looking for different things. Stephen, as a baseball card collector, wanted that mint, pristine, you know, grade 10, perfect corners, perfect edges. And me, as a postal guy, was really looking for what we call postally used, a commercial usage or a postal usage, something that showed evidence. It had the stamp, it had the postmark, the corners weren't so perfect, which indicated it had actually been handled and been through the mail.
Oh, that's fascinating. Hey, we're starting to get close to the end of our time. I hate to say it, I've got so many questions I haven't gotten to. Thank you all for being here. But one thing that we're getting a lot of requests on, Stephen, is many of the people in the audience have sort of written to me saying, can he show us something? Would you mind showing us an item or
okay. Okay, so why don't I just go straight to two people we've been talking about. So can you guys see this?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so that's Joe DiMaggio's rookie uniform he wore in the 1936 season, his rookie year with the Yankees. That's the bat he used between 1937 and 39. And then that's his pants, and that's his cap he wore between 39 and 1941. 41 being significant, obviously, because that's the year he hit the streak. And this is a baseball card that was actually published in 1939 by Play Ball, and it came with a stick of bubble gum. And that's of Joe DiMaggio. That was from 39. And, you know, Dan was saying how significant 39 was to baseball history. And finally, this is the Jackie Robinson jersey. I don't know if you guys can see it, but that's the jersey Jackie Robinson wore in the 1948 season through all the road games, you know, throughout that particular season. And his number 42, you know, is on the back. So,
And, you know, Stephen, I love that that's from 48. You know, 47 is, I guess, like, that's the year everybody associates with Robinson. We all know everything that he faced on the road in 47. But he had a really good year in 47. And as Robinson had a good year, a lot of the catcalling and the taunting and that, it dropped off a lot of it over the course of the season because he was doing really well. But in 48, it's obvious that he's starting off in a slump. And he's having a rough start to the 48 season, and it all comes literally roaring back in these away fields. And so that, to me, that's the uniform that he wore when he faced the absolute kind of nadir of that experience, you know, of experiencing racism in the on the road. In 48, it was even worse, I think, in 48 than it was in 47.
yeah.
I don't have anything to show you, Chris, but what I will do is issue an IOU. And that is, once all of this craziness is over and the exhibit opens, let's arrange something in Washington at the Postal Museum for the Hobart and William Smith community to come see the exhibit and get a tour with me and hopefully with Stephen if his schedule allows him to be there. And let's stay in touch. I'll stay in touch with your advancement team and let's set up a visit to the museum.
Well, Jared, I think we better wrap up on that because that's about one of the nicest offers I've heard. Jared, you want to?
I say we.
There you go. Bank it and run. Bank it and run.
We quit while we're ahead. That was just absolutely awesome, and I'm so glad, Stephen, that you turned the camera around because we all saw that reflection behind you the entire time. Like, I want to see what that is. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, pleasure.
This has been outstanding. It's great to see all these familiar names, especially. I saw Bruce Redpath, who is my classmate, and Stephen, your doubles partner, he said,
Yes.
At Hobart. So thank you all for being. I know President Jacobson was also on. She was leading another Zoom call at noon, so she had to duck out. But I've been getting texts and emails and all throughout this saying how great this was. So thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Chris, for being a great moderator. Dan, really appreciate all that you had to offer this, and good luck with the exhibit. And again, Stephen, great to have you leading this discussion, and thanks so very much.
Chris, anytime you want a day off, you just let Stephen and myself know. We'll teach your class for you. We'll be guest lecturers, and we'll give you a day off whenever you want it.
Careful.
And, you know, real quickly before we all go, and I know so many folks, if you just want to unmic and just join me and just give it a resounding round of applause. My husband's been texting me through the whole thing saying, I could listen to this all day.
Well,
if we have a podcast in our future.
As Dan said, and I think, and Jared and I have talked about, we definitely will do, I think we should do a for the colleges, for Hobart and William Smith, to hopefully have an event at the exhibition when it opens. Hopefully, touch wood, you know, we'll be able to get it open next year, subject to the pandemic. But I will be on a plane in DC for that, rest assured. I don't care what happens at work, but I will be there, and it would be a huge honor to do that. And obviously, I can't wait to for the exhibition to open, and obviously to see a lot of the people who really have been very gracious with their time to join us today, and hopefully to be able to see them in person.
Great.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you.